Have you ever wondered who is the most dangerous person to ever step into a prison is? Thomas Edward Silverstein was a criminal from the United States who spent 42 years of his life in prison after being convicted of 4 different murders while in prison for armed robbery, one of which was reversed. Silverstein spent the final 36 years of his life in solitary prison at the Marion Penitentiary in Illinois for the murder of corrections officer Merle Klutz. Prison officials described him as a vicious killer and former commander of the Aryan Brotherhood prison group. He once even said that the degrading conditions in the prison system contributed to his 3 murders. He was kept in a specially built cell on Range 13 at the ADX Florence Federal Penitentiary in Colorado, also known as the most brutal prison in all of the United States. At the time of his death, he was the Bureau of Prison's longest-held solitary confinement prisoner. Keep watching to find out all about this dangerous man. Silverstein was born to Virginia Conway in Long Beach, California. Virginia left her first husband while pregnant with Silverstein in 1952 and afterward married Thomas Conway, whom Silverstein claimed was his biological father. Virginia divorced Conway 4 years later and married Sid Silverstein, who legally adopted her son. Silverstein was timid, awkward, shy, and regularly tormented as a child in the family's middle-class neighborhood. Virginia Silverstein always scolded her son and demanded that he fight back, telling him that if he ever came home crying because a bully had beaten him up, she would hit him again. Once his mother saw a bully called Gary going home from school, she forced him into her backyard and ordered her son to beat him. He looked at his mother and her black belt, then another at Gary, and there was no turning back. He hit him across the face with all his strength. Virginia had unintentionally started a never-ending cycle of violence when Gary's father spotted Silverstein the next day and dragged him to his house, prompting Gary to respond in kind. She became angry and drove over there, hurling bricks through the window, teaching her son that 2 wrongs created a right. According to Silverstein, that was how his mother was. In her opinion, if someone came at you with a bat, then you should grab your own bat and go at it together. Silverstein was condemned to a California Youth Authority reformatory at the age of 14, where he claims his views towards violence were reinforced. Anyone who refused to fight was abused. When he was just 14, he stole a car and assaulted a police officer. He remembered nothing except forcefully standing his ground while imprisoned at the California Youth Authority Reform Facility. "I despised authority just as I despised bullies," he explained. Silverstein then began using heroin after his parole. He was imprisoned in 1971 together with his cousin and Thomas Conway for committing armed robberies to fund his habit. Silverstein was sentenced to San Quentin Prison in California for armed robbery in 1971 when he was 19 years old. He was paroled 4 years later, but he was caught soon after, which his father, Thomas Conway, and cousin Gerald Hoff for 3 armed robberies. Their loot was less than $11,000, which is $53,000 with inflation in 2022. Silverstein was sentenced to 15 years in prison for armed robbery in 1977 and served at the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Murders at USP Marion. Silverstein became involved with the Aryan Brotherhood while at Leavenworth. He was convicted in 1980 of the bloody murder of inmate Danny Arwell, who allegedly refused to serve as a mule for heroin moving through the jail. He was condemned to life in prison and transferred to the U.S. Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, which was a high-security facility at the time. The conviction was overturned in 1985 when it was discovered that the jailhouse informants who testified during his trial had lied on the stand. Silverstein was held in the Control Unit at Marion, a virtually solitary confinement regime reserved for the prison's most severe management difficulties, which basically means prisoners prone to assaultive or disruptive behavior. He was charged with the murder of Robert Chappell, a member of the D.C. Blacks prison gang in 1981. He and another inmate, Clayton Fountain, were found guilty, and Silverstein was sentenced to life in prison. He avoided a probable death sentence because capital punishment had not yet been restored on a federal level. Silverstein insisted on his innocence. While he was facing trial for Chappell's murder, the Bureau of Prisons moved the national commander of the D.C. Blacks prison gang, Raymond Lee Cadillac Smith, from another prison to the Marion Control Unit. According to jail files, Smith began attempting to kill Silverstein as soon as he arrived at the control unit, trying to take revenge for his gang unit. Silverstein recalled, "I tried to tell Cadillac that I didn't kill Chappell, but he didn't believe me, and he bragged that he was going to kill me. Everyone knew what was going on, and no one did anything to keep us apart. The guards wanted us to kill the other." Silverstein and Clayton Fountain ended up stabbing Cadillac 67 times with homemade weapons. They dragged his body up and down the catwalk in front of the cells after he died, displaying it to the other convicts. Silverstein was then sentenced to life in prison again. Murder of Corrections Officer Klutz. On October 22, 1983, Silverstein assassinated Correction Officer Merle Klutz at USP Marion. After being allowed to leave his cell for a shower, Silverstein devised a trick to get Klutz to move ahead of him, putting himself between Klutz and other officers. He came to a halt outside the cell of Randy Gomez, another inmate. Gomez then handed Silverstein a makeshift jail knife and unlocked his restraints with a homemade key. Klutz was then attacked by Silverstein, who repeatedly stabbed him. Silverstein later claimed he murdered Klutz in retribution for Klutz's intentional harassment of him. Klutz was said to have been fond of destroying paintings by Silverstein, among other things. When art depicts murder, the BOP, or Bureau of Prisons, confiscates it. Clayton Fountain, another Aryan Brotherhood member, used the same approach to murder correctional officer Robert Hoffman a few hours later. The prison Marion was then placed on indefinite lockdown, which lasted for the next 23 years. Following Klutz's murder, Silverstein was moved to the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta and held in solitary confinement. His security level was listed as no human contact. The situation surrounding the murders of correctional officers Klutz and Hoffman inspired the creation of the legendary federal supermax prison, the United States Penitentiary Florence Administrative Maximum Facility, also called the USP Florence AD Max in Colorado, which opened in 1994 and was built to house the federal prison system's most dangerous inmates. ADX Florence detained both Silverstein and Gomez. Fountain, who murdered the other officer, passed away in 2004 in the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisons in Springfield, Missouri. Silverstein was kept in solitary confinement with a lamp in the ceiling that was always on, allowing for continuous camera surveillance. His food was delivered via a slot, and he was only allowed 2 phone calls every month. Silverstein was instructed by Bureau of Prisons head Norman Carlson to have no human interaction at the ADX institution. He was placed in an 80-square-foot cell and confined for 23 hours a day, leaving 1 hour to exercise in a cage, because there was no federal death sentence for killing a guard at the time of Klutz's murder. Riot in Atlanta and transferred to Leavenworth. During the Atlanta prison riots in 1987, Cuban detainees at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta liberated Silverstein from his isolation cell. 1 week later, they turned Silverstein over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's hostage rescue team. Officials at the Bureau of Prisons were reportedly concerned that Silverstein would begin killing correctional personnel held hostage by the Cubans. Before releasing him to the Bureau of Prisons, the Cubans let him out of his isolation cell and allowed him to travel freely throughout the prison. One of the captive prison officers had a reputation for being nice to Silverstein. When the guard handcuffed Silverstein, he made a point of asking if his shackles were too tight. Silverstein challenged him and finally spared him. Negotiators for the Bureau of Prisons were able to persuade the Cuban riot leaders to hand over Silverstein as a demonstration of good faith. A relatively easy decision for them, given that Silverstein's status was secondary to the Cuban leaders' ambitions during the conflict. Silverstein was later transferred back to Leavenworth, where he remained for the following 18 years. When USP Leavenworth was reduced to a medium security facility in 2005, Silverstein was sent to ADX Florence, a Colorado Supermax facility. His earliest possible release date was November 2, 2095. Allegations of torture and injustice. According to Silverstein, the no human contact category is effectively a type of torture intended for people who murder correctional employees. A Bureau of Prisons officer told author Pete Early, quote, "When an inmate kills a guard, he must be punished." They can't execute Silverstein, so they must make his life a living hell. Otherwise, other convicts will murder guards as well. There must be some form of ultimate punishment. Every prisoner at the time understood what Silverstein was going through. The prison wants them to understand that if they crossed the same line he did, they would pay dearly. Ted Sellers, a former criminal who encountered Silverstein during his 25-year incarceration, said Silverstein became a legend at Leavenworth. According to Sellers, he is not as awful as they paint him to be. Sure, he's dangerous if they force him up against the wall. However, there were some filthy and horrible guards at Marion who would deliberately deceive you. You're dealing with someone who is locked up 24 hours a day. Of course he has a temper. Death. Silverstein became unwell after heart surgery after 36 years in solitary confinement. His brief stay at Denver's St. Anthony's Hospital was his first break from strict isolation since the early 1980s. As he wrote in his memoir, however, dying on May 11, 2019 may have been a relief. Drip, drip, drip. The minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years constantly drip away with no end or relief in sight. Conclusion. So, what do you think about Thomas Silverstein? Do you think he deserved the treatment he got? Let us know why in the comments below.